Welcome to your reset with Christiane Piano, where the purpose is to support you in releasing all that you are not, so the truth of who you really are can emerge. This is accomplished through working with the body-mind from an ontological perspective. We use various modalities to support you in supporting yourself exactly where you are, so that you may return to an experience of wholeness and ease, moment by moment. Deep reflection is one of the greatest tools through which to do this. To take a moment, to pause, assess, reflect, and literally and figuratively reset, come back to center, and move back into your one and precious life with increased clarity and purpose. Hello, I am Christiane Piano. I'm so glad you've carved out this time to be here with me. And whether you've been following this journey for a while or you're just joining me today, you are arriving at a very particular moment in our conversation. If you haven't had a chance to listen to episode 103, the choice of the second round, I'd love to invite you to start there. In that conversation, we explored that pivotal threshold where the instructions we were given about how to live life finally run out of road. It's that moment when we realize the first round of living, the one fueled by what was expected of us, is over, and the next chapter is about the conscious choice to continue our own evolution. It's a shift from seeing yourself as a finished product to realizing you are a continual unfolding process. Maybe for you, that unfolding looks like the quiet, joyful pull toward a painting class. Or maybe it's the heavy, necessary willingness to have a difficult conversation about a relationship that no longer resonates. Stepping into the not yet without a map. But here's the thing about being in an unfolding process. It requires us to be present for the unfolding. And lately, I've been noticing how easy it is to interrupt that process, to reach for a map that isn't ours or a screen that offers a temporary escape from the friction of our own growth. I've started calling it the digital vacuum, that space where we lose our frequency because we've outsourced our attention to an elsewhere. In the vacuum, we aren't exactly away, but we aren't fully here either. We're suspended in a state of peeking in on the world, while the vivid reality of our own unfolding happens just outside the frame. I think it would prove supportive if we took a look at what it is exactly in our experience about being right here makes that elsewhere so attractive. Is it possible that this suspension feels safer than being all the way home in our own skin? Does the raw, unedited reality of our lives feel a little too vulnerable to face without a buffer? I invite you to pause a moment and reflect on your own experience and where this may apply to you. As we stand at that threshold, I would like to ask you a question about what happens when that unfolding feels a bit too vulnerable. What do you do when the silence of your own life starts to feel like too much? Because there is a catch, isn't there? As soon as we decide to be all the way here, to really inhabit our own skin, we encounter a quiet, persistent pull away from ourselves. Think back for a moment. I'm talking about that primal moment when we were very small, when we reached out to grab life with both hands, full of curiosity and reach. And then something happened. Maybe the world flinched. Maybe we were told in 1,000 tiny ways to be still, to be quiet, to behave ourselves. We learned that reaching wasn't always safe. So we grew a protective skin. We learned how to numb that vitality so we could fit in the room we were given. We learned how to turn down our own volume to dim our own light just to stay safe. This is the state of being sucked out of our own presence. Whether it's the magnetic pull of the screen, obsessive tidying, or overworking, it is a reach for a vacuum to catch our breath because participating in our own evolution feels overwhelming when we are already so tired from just kicking the can down the road to stay safe. We reach for those dimming switches now, these habits that dull our intensity, not because we're lazy, but because the unseen labor of maintenance, the effort it takes to keep a life standing that we've already outgrown, is exhausting. We reach for a vacuum to catch our breath because participating in our own evolution feels overwhelming when we are already spent just trying to keep things as they are for one more day. The vacuum is the digital sofa, if you will. We sink into it when we don't want to do the work of the hallway, that not yet space when we aren't quite ready to be the stretch. Today we're going to look at these shelters, not as flaws, but as mechanisms for coexistence with the parts of our lives we aren't ready to move yet. I will also be inviting you to open a window to a different way of being. We will be taking a look at the courage it takes to stop peeking in on the world and start actually inhabiting it. It could be likened to sitting on the bank of a river and watching the water flow, analyzing the depth, the speed of the current as an observer, as opposed to stepping into the water and experiencing the flow of the current of the water for yourself. Just recently, while working on this very episode, I hit that bank. I hit a wall. I realized I was sitting there trying to think the water into existence instead of actually being in it. I felt foggy, stuck and heavy. I was trapped in the labor of translation, that exhausting effort of trying to turn the raw, wordless truth of our lives into something packaged or explainable, trying to force the unfolding into words before I had even allowed it to happen in my own body. That wall was the signal that I simply couldn't think my way through this anymore. I couldn't stay on the bank of the river another moment. So I went for a walk, not to find an answer, but to move through the heaviness and clear the slate. And it was there on that hill that the fog began to lift. I stopped trying to force the message and simply started to participate in the lived experience of it. I want to bring you onto that hill with me, into a walk I took just the other day. It began as a simple way to meet a moment of stuckness, but it ended up being a lesson in what it means to truly participate in being human. This past Monday, I found myself at my desk, sleeves rolled up, ready to dive into the creation of this very episode. I had an idea of what I wanted to speak to. I'd even announced the topic at the end of episode 103. But as I began to write, a familiar tension started to surface. It became clear to me how unclear I actually was. It wasn't a lack of information. It was that life was trying to speak through me, but there was so much in the way, and it felt like a wrestling match between the raw, wordless truth of the experience and my desperate labor to translate it into something you could understand. The knottedness in my neck and shoulders began to build. My breath grew shallow and my mind was whirling at a speed that simply wouldn't support clarity. I was hitting that wall where the mind tries to force the unfolding into existence, a vacuum of thinking that only leads back to itself. I knew I couldn't think my way out of a thought loop. I had to intentionally interrupt the experience. I knew that what was needed wasn't more effort at the desk, but a change of environment. So I put on my sneakers and my jacket and I stepped out the door. I headed up the hill. It's a steep climb, and at first my mind was still back at the desk trying to solve the problem. But then the hill started to demand something from me. It demanded my breath. It demanded the strength in my calves. Simply put, it demanded a shift in my attention from the mind to the body. Have you ever felt that subtle, heavy threshold where your thoughts finally give the way to the rhythm of your own movement? That movement where you stop thinking about the path and start actually feeling the ground beneath you? I find that these moments are where the real work happens. It's why I sometimes refer to living into life as a laboratory. This is a practice of meeting yourself where you are, a state that shifts and changes based on the circumstances. Whether it's a yoga mat in your living room or a steep trail in the February air, it's a space where you can't just consume the experience. You can't peek in on a stretch or an incline. You have to participate in the tension. You have to be the climb. And what I mean by that is the point where there is no longer a you observing the effort from the outside. There's no room left to think about the climb because you are entirely occupied by it. You stay with that physical reality until the mental resistance finally gives way to release. To reset requires working with the tension. It requires this kind of participation. As I leaned into that incline, the laboratory of the hill began to take over. My breath, which had been trapped in my chest at the desk, finally began to drop down. The shift was a gradual felt sense of things are shifting. The cold February air hit my lungs and the winter air was chilling my skin, but the movement was warming my blood. Slowly, the labor of translation, that desperate need to make sense of things, began to suspend. I was finally moving through the world not as an observer, but as a participant. I wasn't thinking about presence anymore. I was simply experiencing it. I was allowing the flow of the body-mind to exist without the mind needing to dominate the conversation. I was crossing the bridge of emotion and felt experience, the kind of wholeness that simply cannot be captured, only lived. It is that tipping point of movement as action. Sometimes it's internal, sometimes it's external, and sometimes it's a combination of both. To invite the shift on this day, I knew I needed both. And in that space of wholeness, the world starts to feel and look differently, as the shift has already begun within. The labor of translation suspended, and I was simply there. As I walked, it wasn't a curated, perfect silence. I turned a corner. I came upon two women who were out walking together and chatting about life. I surprised myself as I overtook them. As I did, it became very clear to me that I was challenged by simply hearing their voices. I wanted quiet. I needed quiet to clear my body-mind. I wanted to soak in the silence of nature. So I started to think about options, and my mind immediately tried to take the reins. I should take a different path. I need to move away from this noise. And strangely enough, I did not. It was a blip in time, a quick decision. My eyes and feet just needed to turn and take a different path. But I stayed the course. Now I was aware of the choice, and I quite honestly found it interesting. I felt life was guiding me, and I needed to lean into it. So I stayed with the noise and the friction. And because I stayed, because of that split-second decision, the world opened up. As I climbed the next hill, I felt my attention being drawn to the horizon, and then up to the sky. I saw the light piercing through a heart-shaped cloud, and for a second, I wasn't a writer or a practitioner. I was just a daughter, feeling the presence of my father in the sky. My heart melted, and I felt so alive and one with everything and nothing, all at once. And the shift continued. Further up the hill, as the ground leveled out, I saw the local gardener, someone I hadn't seen since November, speaking with another man. I offered a warm hello in passing and kept moving, simply part of the flow of the afternoon. But soon after, the two women I had overtaken earlier passed me by, and then I felt another presence behind me. I heard footsteps. I turned and was met with a big smile and a warm hello. It was the man who had been speaking with the gardener. Now, normally this is where the script of polite society takes over. I would have smiled back, maybe said, "Enjoy your walk," and he would have moved past me. But that isn't what unfolded. For him to have caught up to me, he had to be moving at a much faster pace. He was an older gentleman, at least in his 70s, but he had a sprint to his step and a glow in his eyes. He had that particular kind of youthful skin that only comes from a vitality within, regardless of age. Instead of passing me, we found ourselves walking side by side. We began to talk, not about the weather or the surface of things, but about life and the state of the world. When I reached the point where I had planned to turn back, I didn't. It was another blip decision, a simple, quiet choice to keep going. I wasn't following a plan anymore. I was following the conversation. We walked for over an hour, and in that hour, time suspended itself. I wasn't a writer trying to capture a moment or a practitioner trying to observe a process. I was just there. There was only the simplicity of I am here and you are here. This is the very thing we are so often afraid of, this clearing of silence that we mistake for a void. We try to drown it out with anything that feels like filling, a scroll, a ping, or the frantic noise of a to-do list. But as I walked, I was reminded once again that this space isn't empty at all. It is the only place where a connection, like that heart-shaped cloud, or a meeting with that youthful glow can actually land. So I have to ask, what if the noise we surround ourselves with is actually just a way to coexist with a life we aren't ready to move yet? What if we are reaching for these dimming switches, not because we are lazy, but because the labor of maintenance, keeping a version of ourselves standing that we've already outgrown, is simply too much? What if the vacuum is just the shelter we use when we aren't ready to step into the water and experience the flow for ourselves? As we sit with these questions, I gently remind you that the more honest you are with yourself, the more fruitful this reflection will be for you. After all, you are in the privacy of your own heart. No one else is looking. And the reason this honesty is so vital is that if we look closely, most of us are living two lives. There's the life we are maintaining for the world, and then there's the elsewhere, the place we go to hide from the fact that we aren't ready to move yet. Maybe your shelter is the constant planning of the next trip, or the distraction of another course, or the search for a new job that you aren't actually looking for. It's the noise we use to drown out the friction of a life that no longer fits. No one can see your thoughts right now. This is a safe space, but it's also a demanding one, because your growth is determined by how honest you are willing to be with yourself in this moment. What are you using to defer the weight of your own life? What is the shelter you've built to stay safe from the unstructured silence of the clearing? Don't look for the answer that sounds good. Look for the one that resonates with your present state of affairs. I've had to ask myself those same questions, because I realized that my own version of outsourcing my vitality, my own reach for the digital vacuum, was actually just a way of staying safe from the sheer voltage of being alive. As I walked back down that hill, parting ways with Carlo with a simple handshake and a felt goodbye, I realized something. That hour of connection stayed with me because I was actually participating in it. But participation requires something of us. It requires a quality of presence, the willingness to be all the way here for whatever is unfolding, whether that is the feeling of the air on our skin or the quiet thoughts that surface when the noise stops. And this is where we run into the friction. We often aren't all there because we are simply exhausted. We are depleted from the ways we reach into the vacuum, whatever that is for you, to fill a void that never seems to stay full. We reach for the scroll, the information, the doing, and we don't realize that the very thing we are reaching for is what's sucking up our vitality. It leaves us with nothing left for the actual moment. There is a truth I often return to, that we can only meet others as deeply as we have met ourselves. If we are constantly leaking our energy into a vacuum, we aren't home to meet our own experience, let alone the person standing in front of us. we are offering a shadow of ourselves instead of the fullness. You may have noticed that during these episodes, I invite you to reflect. I ask you questions. And the reason I do this is to invite your active participation. This podcast isn't a lecture. It's not here for you to simply consume or to receive advice. It's here to support you in the lived experience of your own life. Part of the intention behind this space we are sharing requires us to practice the pause, slowly, with baby steps and compassion, to reflect on what I am inviting you to consider and how it may resonate in the very fiber of your own being. So in that spirit, I invite you to ask yourself, what does this look like for me? How does this apply to my life? How do I check out? What do I use to check out? What am I checking out from? Stay with this for a moment, if you will. Put this on pause or come back to it at another moment. We are often so unaware of when we are checking out. What is the itch you reach to scratch when the silence gets too loud? Is it a scroll, a workout, sex, substances, food, a task, a plan? What do you reach for so you can avoid whatever it is that is creating a discomfort? I ask you this because moving from surviving to truly experiencing your life requires ownership, awakeness, and a great deal of humility. It requires a willingness to coexist with our discomfort, to learn to support ourselves through it rather than running from it. Because that discomfort, it isn't a failure, it's a teacher. But I wonder if, like me, you've felt a certain fear of that teacher. We've been conditioned to believe that if we feel discomfort, something's wrong. And so we often, without even realizing it, we instinctively reach for the mute button. And in doing so, we are attempting to reduce the exhaustion or the too muchness of the moment, hoping we can just cut out the hard parts and keep the rest of our lives intact. But I invite you to consider the catch-22 in that. When we numb the overwhelming parts of life, we numb everything, as the nervous system doesn't seem to have a filter for what it numbs. We numb our joy, our curiosity, and our capacity to truly see the people right in front of us. This is where the mirror of our world, and especially our children, becomes so clear. When we hand them a tablet to keep them quiet, we might think we are just managing a moment of behavior. But what if we are actually modeling a relationship with reality? What if we are inadvertently teaching them that when life gets too quiet or too big or too boring, the only solution is to check out? We are showing them how to use a screen as a boundary against themselves. And as they grow into teenagers and young adults, we see them reaching for their own versions of that vacuum, just as we do. Our children are our mirrors. Our world is our mirror. And the question is, are we willing to look? We often blame the glass for what it reflects, but if the screen disappeared tomorrow, the vacuum would remain. We would fill it with work, with noise, or with the frantic pursuit of elsewhere. We often treat this as a problem to be solved, but the reason it persists is that we are missing a fundamental distinction. The issue here isn't the device in our hand. It's our relationship to it. We use it, whatever your it is, to move away from ourselves. It is a distraction, yes, but we have to ask, what is the distraction serving? What is it numbing us from? And don't kid yourself. This isn't just about screens. Even meditation, a yoga practice, or the spiritual pursuit of a better self can be used for this purpose. Anything can be used as an escape if the relationship to the practice is one of avoidance. If we're using the mat or the cushion to bypass the grit of our actual reality, then it is just another version of the vacuum. Whatever that is, can you see that the it doesn't matter? What matters is that we are caught in a direction, a quiet, habitual turning away from the center of our own lives. We turn away because right now being all the way here feels like a collision. It is the friction of forcing ourselves to stay in a version of our lives that we have already outgrown. We are standing in the hallway feeling the pinch of a shape that no longer fits, but we aren't ready to stretch into the next one. But here's the catch-22. The longer we use that vacuum to numb the discomfort, the more we exhaust the very vitality we need to eventually move. We are draining the battery of the self to keep the elsewhere alive, leaving us with no energy to actually step through the door. And this is the missing distinction. We think we are protecting ourselves by turning away, but we are actually just leaking our power. We are waiting for the right time to move, realizing that the right time is fueled by the very presence we are currently numbing out. So, what happens when we make a different choice? What happens when we practice the internal movement of turning back toward ourselves? What happens when we reclaim our sovereignty? You see, sovereignty isn't a destination or result like a clear desk. It's the integrity of the moment. When we are peeking in on our lives through a screen or a distraction, we are outsourcing our existence to a spectator. We are watching a life we should be leading. But when we step in, when we choose to stay in the room with the silence or the friction, we are reclaiming the rhythm and the resonance of our own pulse. This is because the digital vacuum isn't actually a tech problem. It's a stewardship problem. We use the screen, the noise, the distraction, to avoid the labor of translation and the friction of our own lives. But when we choose to face the music, we stop leaking our vitality into an elsewhere. We become the presence inhabiting the vessel. When I walked back into my home after that hour with Carlo, I didn't return to the same state I had left. By stepping into the friction of the hill, by choosing to stay in the conversation instead of turning back to my plan, I had interrupted the knottedness. I had cleared out the knots in my body-mind enough to allow life to finally speak through me. I felt enriched, refreshed, and simply alive. And when I sat back down at the same desk where I had been so stuck, the clarity was just there. The work didn't change, the deadline didn't change, but my context had shifted. I was no longer muscling through with mental energy trying to force a clarity that cannot be forced. I had stopped pushing and started allowing. I had done the work to remove what was in the way, and in that clearing, the resonance returned. And in that moment, it hit me. I realized then that the digital vacuum is a choice we make to be a spectator because being a participant feels too raw. It's the digital sofa we sink into because we aren't yet ready to be the stretch. I was no longer a spectator looking through the glass waiting for things to make sense. I was the participant right in the thick of the unfolding. But we have to ask ourselves, if we are always peeking in on life through the glass, who is actually living ours? If we are always a half step removed, who is inhabiting our relationships? Who is feeling the air on our skin or the blood flowing through our veins? The truth is, we stay behind the glass because being that close to our own lives, being a participant in the not knowing, is terrifying. It requires a level of vulnerability that we aren't always ready for. Because we've been taught that we have to have it all figured out to be safe. But I realized at that desk that body-mind well-being actually requires the opposite. It requires basking in humility. And when you come from there, when you start from the place of not knowing, well, then the world starts to look and feel quite different. Because the need to have it all figured out is really just a shield. It's a way of keeping life at arm's length so it can't surprise us or hurt us. But when you drop that shield, something remarkable happens. The too muchness of the world stops being a threat and starts being a conversation. You stop trying to manage the moment and you start actually being moved by it. Reclaiming your sovereignty is about the trust that you don't need a map or a numbing switch to survive the hallway of your own life. It is the willingness to be the unfolding itself rather than the person watching it happen. When you put down the dimming switch and step into the clearing of the present moment, you aren't met with a void that needs filling. You are met with the vivid, unedited reality of your own existence you are met with that same Carlo glow, a vitality that doesn't come from doing or consuming, but from the simple radical act of being all the way home in the depths of your own being. Then you aren't just surviving the day, you are actually inhabiting it. And it's important to remember that while this choice, this turning back toward yourself, happens in the quiet of your own life, you aren't doing it in a vacuum. We are all, in our own way, trying to find our footing in the clearing. You are not alone in this. There is a common thread that unites us all in this messy, precious human condition. Whether you are in one of the now 384 cities listening to this episode, or sitting in the quiet of your own kitchen, please know that your presence is the greatest gift you have to offer to your children, to your world, and most importantly, to yourself. This week, I invite you to just notice the reach. When you feel that familiar tug to check out, to turn away from the too muchness or the quiet, perhaps ask yourself, what is unfolding right now? And how can I practice meeting myself to support myself? Because this is a practice. It isn't a destination, and it isn't a rule. It will change from day to day, just as you do. So as always, I invite you to take baby steps. Lean into support more often than you usually allow yourself to. We are all students of life. None of us has it all figured out. And really, how absurd it is to think that life, in all its complexity and mystery, could be figured out. That's just arrogance speaking. May you give yourself permission this week to face the music, to sit in the silence of the unknown, to have the conversation, or simply to be where you are without an agenda. Because when you come from that place of humility, you are no longer a spectator waiting for things to make sense. You're the participant, right in the thick of the unfolding, where the clarity doesn't come from a plan, but from the simple, grounded truth of your own presence. You are reclaiming the rhythm and the resonance of your own pulse. Thank you for tuning in. And if you found this episode helpful, please do share it with a friend, and don't forget to like, follow, or leave a review. It really does help other people find it. I'm Christiane Piano, and this has been your Reset Reflections. If you are interested in working with me on any level of body-mind well-being, whether it be through individual body-mind maturation work sessions, perhaps participating in a series, individual privates, or through my video-on-demand services, if you have questions, if you would like to engage on any level, feel free to schedule a free 15-minute consult in the appointment section, www.christianepiano.com, or email me directly at growth@christianepiano.com.